All right. Hello, everybody. Um, a belated Happy New Year to everybody who's tuning in today for Woodhull's very first Censorship Series program of 2024. Um, Really excited today to talk with the three brilliant people that I'm going to introduce you to in a second. I'm hoping today that we are going to give all of you listening some tools to fight against censorship in your own community this year. We're trying to give you a head start before these state and federal legislative sessions really get off the ground. And hopefully, we can stop some bad bills from passing right from the start. So, thanks everybody for being here. We have a lot to get to, so I'm going to introduce our panelists in just a second. But before I do that, I just want to let you all know that we would love for you to make use of that Zoom chat. So if you have questions or comments or reactions to anything we're sharing here, please feel free to drop that in the Zoom chat. As well, if you want to tell us who you are and where you're tuning in from today, I'd love to hear that as well. Also, want to let you know that this program is recorded. It will be available on Woodhull's YouTube page, and I will be sending an email with that link, usually within about 24 hours of our program ending today. So if you have to head out early, whatever the case may be, don't worry. We've got you covered with the recording. I will also be including links to all of the resources mentioned today in that follow up email. So you can give your full attention to our panelists today. You don't have to worry about furiously jotting anything down in case you miss it. So, without further ado, so excited to welcome our panelists today. I'm going to briefly introduce them. If you all just kind of give a wave when I say your name. With me today, I have India McKinney. She is the Director of Federal Affairs at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I have Melody Garcia, co-director of the New Moon Network. And last but certainly not least, Jacqueline Elaine, program coordinator for the Freedom to Learn at Penn America. So thank you all for being here today. I am going to just get right into it because, like I said, we've got a lot to cover today. So I felt like last year in 2023, we saw a lot of censorship happening. And we saw it in a lot of different areas, online, in schools, book bans, all these other things. And so before we dive into 2024, I would love to know from each of your perspectives, because you each have a different expertise and different subject area. Tell us a little bit about how censorship looked in 2023 from your vantage point. And India, I'll start with you.
Sure. So I'm the Director of Federal Affairs at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And so my focus is entirely on the federal government and Congress. So there's a lot of stuff that's been happening in the states, and I pay attention to it somewhat, but because it will inform what happens in Congress. But my focus has been primarily on Congress, and there's certainly been enough there to keep us occupied. So one of the things that we saw a lot in 2023 is some of the same types of things that we have seen before, but with new reasons. Like the biggest reason has been we need to keep the children safe. There are bad things that are happening to children online, and we need to do something to stop it. Does that thing mean comprehensive privacy legislation that would help all users? No, it is only focused on children. It is only focused on content that children might see. And that's where we run into a lot of the issues, which we can talk more about. We have a lot of issues, and they're all a little bit different in the way that they interpret it. But the reasoning behind it is all the same. We must protect the children. And the way to do that is censorship, because we can't let them see bad things.
Yeah, we're going to talk a lot about that particular theme today. So I'm just going to move down the row. Melody, what about you? What did you see in 2023?
Yeah, so in 2023, as you know, Mandy, Woodhull, of course, led the constitutional challenge against FOSTA, the Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act. And while that wasn't a total landmark victory, I think the Supreme Court decision that came out of that was interesting and wasn't necessarily detrimental, right? But really called for us to kind of further, or for legislatures to kind of further define what some of these things they're trying to censor mean. So thank you for that. And as for sex workers, so I co-direct the New Moon Network, and we're connected across the U.S. To grassroots sex worker-led organizations. And our mission is to kind of help build capacity and support the movement through philanthropy and education and other things. So, we continue to see in 2023 folks being censored online, places like Instagram and TikTok and even Threads, and with the interesting things that happened with former Twitter, now X. Lots of folks being taken offline, their work being cited as, offensive or going against community guidelines for a lot of these things. And that very much echoes some of the anti-trans bills that we're seeing, and obscenity bills that we're seeing. So I think going into 2024, we're primed for all kinds of fuckery. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that might be the perfect word for it. So Jacqueline, tell us, from your perspective and PEN America's work, what were the biggest censorship challenges last year?
Yeah, so at PEN America, we've been tracking the proliferation of legislation that undermines the freedom to learn in K through 12 schools and in higher education since 2021. And the first wave of legislation we saw in 2021 really targeted the teaching of so-called critical race theory in schools and issues related to discussions of race, racial inequality. What we saw in 2023 is that the legislative threat to educational freedom changed somewhat. We started to see an increasing preoccupation with discussions of sexual diversity in K through 12 schools. So, for example, the so-called Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, most famously, other legislation that targets, even talking about sexual diversity in K through 12. We also saw an increase in legislation that undermines institutional autonomy. So instead of directly telling teachers and professors what they can and can't say in the classroom, we saw somewhat cleverer legislation emerge, legislation that undermines the autonomy of institutions of higher education in terms of control over, state control over curricula, shuttering academic programs like gender studies. And then finally, I'll just mention briefly one other thing we noticed on or one other thing we tracked, sort of in the same vein as threats to educational or institutional autonomy, is an attack on DEI initiatives. So in Texas, we've actually seen the banning of DEI offices and initiatives in public higher education institutions. And so those are three kind of main trends that we looked at in 2023.
Yeah. And, I think for folks listening, the connection between your three areas of expertise might not be super clear. But I think what we're going to get into is that there's a lot of the same themes being used to push different types of legislation. And a lot of these themes relate to sexuality, sexual freedom, particularly LGBTQ identity. We've heard the word obscenity get thrown around a whole lot. And for folks who are interested in learning more about that, if you go back to our November program, it's all about obscenity and what it is and what it isn't. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that today. But, censorship is a really broad topic, right? And I think one of the points of this series is to highlight the ways that it infiltrates our lives and our laws in ways that we might not immediately understand. So, let's switch gears. Let's start talking about 2024. India, tell us what's going on, at the federal level with a lot of this online censorship legislation, or, what are you watching for as we get underway this year?
Yeah, so one of the biggest things that I'm worried about right now is a bill in the Senate called the Kids Online Safety Act, or KOSA, which is fundamentally a censorship bill. And so the purpose of this bill and some of the big proponents of this bill has to do with mental health of teenagers in particular, as they go about their lives and engage with content on social media. And so this bill and some of the proponents are claiming that because of things that they saw on Instagram or on Snapchat or other places on the internet, harm has happened to their teenagers, whether it's eating disorders or suicide attempts or other self-harm things. It's less about obscenity and more about mental health in its various aspects. Depending on which of the sponsors you listen to, it also does include things related to LGBTQ health, gender affirming care, other things like that. But it's really the focus of this is mental health. And if you read the bill, some of these specific mental health harms are listed. These are the things that we see as problematic. Anything related to eating disorders, and other really concerning trends in mental health of teenagers in the United States right now. And so there was a recent CDC report about the mental health of teenagers in the United States. And some of the findings from the CDC report are legitimately concerning. The CDC report doesn't go into why, and it certainly doesn't try to pinpoint any one particular cause. And I will also say that, having been a teenage girl, and I would imagine many other people who have been teenage girls will recognize a lot of the language that is currently being used and thrown against Instagram or Reddit or Discord or some of these other platforms. That's really, it sounds, to me at least, it sounds really, really similar to what we heard in the 90s with glossy ads and supermodels. And like the reason teenage girls are having eating disorders is because Kate Moss shows up and tries to sell you perfume in the cover and the inside of 17 magazine or whatever. A lot of the concern sounds really, really, really similar. It's just we have a new boogeyman to poke at. And there are a lot of different ways that KOSA is problematic. Age verification is a huge, huge, huge problem that we should spend some time talking about. And so again, if you're a parent of a teenager right now, we're not about to tell you that there's not a mental health crisis of teenagers in the United States right now. We just got out of a global pandemic. A lot of people spent a lot of time at home, and some of the social emotional learning that comes from being around other people. And this is for adults as well as young adults, as well as teenagers, as well as younger kids. Like, I think we all had the experience in some form or fashion of like when we reemerged, we were all a little bit feral. And so having to figure out how to be in space with each other again. Online spaces were transformed during the pandemic in a lot of cases. And so while as a parent, I would certainly love to have more control over everything that my children see online. That's not necessarily the best thing for the children. And it's also really, really problematic when it's the government having control over what my children see online and the government mandating what platforms are allowed to let parents let their children see online. I don't particularly like senators making decisions for my children instead of me. And especially when we're talking about, in the current version of KOSA, it's state attorneys general who have the power to determine harmful content. So depending on where you live, Ken Paxton in Texas may have a different opinion than Rabanta in California. And I don't think it's a great idea for different teenagers in different states to have access to different information, especially when you're talking about things like reproductive health, gender affirming care, basic facts about health and the world. There's a lot that's going on in the world right now that is stressful, that is harmful, that is concerning. The patriarchy is alive and well. So to say that there is a mental health crisis among teenagers, especially teenage girls, like, yes, that is problematic. Yes, we should talk about this, but I don't think it makes sense to focus on the internet or internet platforms as the root cause of everything that is wrong today with society in America. I mean, you can look at the exact same arguments for television, for radio, for newspapers, and for books. Just keep going back further in time about how we distribute information. All of these arguments have been made before. We have heard it all before. Instagram is not the problem. The problem is something way deeper and much more insidious. But we should also pass privacy legislation because there are problems with Instagram. So, you know.
Yeah, I think well said, India. I think there are lots of problems in the world, and there are also lots of solutions that maybe we could be talking about instead of kind of blaming big tech and social media for all of the ills of society. But, speaking of books, books come to mind quite frequently when I think of PEN America. And so, Jacqueline, I'm going to shift to you. What's PEN America focusing on? What are you looking at in terms of 2024? Is there particular legislation you're concerned about?
Okay, I'll start off by saying I don't work on book bans myself. I have amazing colleagues at PEN America who do work on book bans. That's their whole job, is combating book bans. But I do have a statistic that I just want to mention here. With regard to book banning. So from July 2021 to June 2023, PEN America's index of school book bans recorded 5,894 instances of book bans across 41 states and 247 school districts. So this is a major concern. There's been a sustained focus on banning books written for young adults, especially books that contain kind of descriptions of violence or racism, or books that contain characters with marginalized identities like LGBTQ people of color. And we expect these trends to continue into 2024.
Yeah. That is unfortunate. I will say there have been some really, we're not talking about the courts in this particular program, but there's been some good news from the courts about book bans, some good decisions out of Florida and Iowa related to the way in which certain districts have been pulling books off the shelf. So that's a trend I'd like to see continue into 2024. So keep our fingers crossed for that. All right. So Melody, let's talk about sexual expression, sexual freedom, sex work. Where do we expect to see censorship be the most prevalent in those areas this year?
Yeah, so I mean, the internet continues to be the kind of main battleground where we're seeing a lot of this censorship. Folks use the internet to meet clients, to screen clients, to put up ads, to find work, to distribute their products and services, right? And so we fully expect, kind of no matter how the presidential election goes, we expect to continue to see this root cause, right? This conflation of sex work with sex trafficking and violence to continue to fuel legislation that will, again, do things to India's point, do things to target the platforms, right? Or to target the users of the platforms, which is bad policy. But, we're seeing, because of the pandemic, more online sex workers than ever. especially with the spike in OnlyFans and other content creators. We're seeing potential backlash from payment processors, which is and has been happening, right? MasterCard and Visa are notorious for having, pulled their ability to pay people through online platforms who are making money. So we expect to continue to see that. And, those things are directly kind of related to the stigma that goes against sex work and sex workers, the conflation between consensual sex work and sex trafficking, and the implications that it'll have on the children, right? I expect we'll see more of this age verification legislation pop up in different places as this sort of like this fear-based momentum, right, to create policy that again goes back to sort of helping the children, is expanded. We also see this really interesting in the sex worker rights movement specifically, this interesting pattern of self-censorship that happens, right, especially by groups, grassroots organizations, or individuals doing activism within sex worker rights and within like queer and trans liberation circles, who are going after funding, for example, and are unable to really be out about their identities or about their work or about who they're serving because they're scared of being discriminated against. They're scared of this very real kind of attack on their bodily autonomy and how they identify themselves. And again, there's this conflation with sex work and sex trafficking that a lot of people just really don't take the time to understand the nuances between. So, I think for New Moon Network, we're really trying to move upstream and provide upstream solutions for some of these things that really, address some of the root causes of stigma and of criminalization and censorship.
Yeah, lots going on. I want to this wasn't specifically in our outline, but I want to talk about it because both India and Melody, you brought it up, and this is the age verification laws. We saw, I think, like 7 of these in 2023 in various states pass. And I think we're going to see a whole lot more this year. I think there's already, last I heard, about 20 states considering some sort of age verification measure. And I wonder if one of you wouldn't mind giving a quick, brief explanation of what these laws are and why they promote censorship.
So I can start. So one of them, the sort of critical, again, I don't know the state laws as well. So at the federal level, it's basically putting part of the internet behind a firewall that says, if you don't prove to us in some way that you are of age, and what of age means is different depending on what bill you're looking at, then you can't see this type of content. So it's unclear exactly what that looks like. The legislation does not spell out how platforms have to do this. And there is an unfortunate, strongly held belief of some of the staffers that I've talked to in Congress that many of these platforms actually already know how old all of their users are. And so they don't have to do anything new. They're already collecting this information because they're all data brokers. And so like Facebook knows everything about you. And so they should know better than to be showing this content to 13-year-olds or whatever. But somehow platforms have to verify the age of all of their users and then restrict content to users of a certain age. And so basically what that means is all platforms will have to figure out how to verify the age of their users one way or another and hold on to that information, which means they have to collect additional, if they weren't already collecting that personally identifiable information, they have to now collect it and they have to store it, because if there is some sort of lawsuit challenging, like, you showed this content to my 13-year-old, what's up with that? The platform has to be able to say, well, we have a reason to believe that this is not a 13-year-old, that this is an 18-year-old because reasons. They have to hold on to that information, which is, again, an issue with privacy for everyone. So, one of the things that we argue a lot about at EFF is minimization of the types of data that are collected from the companies that don't actually need it. So, like, your car doesn't need to know your sexual history, and so there should not be collecting it, even though they are, because they can. So why wouldn't they? That's a whole different topic of conversation. It's just one that is super dystopian and creeps me out a lot. But platforms like Reddit, like Discord, like even some other more, WhatsApp, they may not make you prove who you are. I mean, Reddit in particular is all about your username and your anonymity. Are they going to have to start collecting that information or figure out how to verify users in one particular way or another, and then also figure out how to store that data in a way that is secure and not at risk, which is, that second part's impossible. So more people are going to have access to that data. What is that going to look like? Do you have to upload driver's licenses? Do you have to start uploading passports? And so that also means that for users who do choose to do that, so they can get to the spicy parts of the internet, that means that your browsing is no longer anonymous. There's no, for whatever anonymity there is left, that's going to have to go away, or the platforms themselves face significant additional liability that they don't currently face, which is a pretty significant problem. So one of the things that we've seen Facebook suggest, or Meta, I guess, is that it really should be a burden that only the app stores, Google Play or the Apple App Store, has to carry. So it's on them to make sure that when the app gets downloaded to a user's phone, that the age verification happens at that point. So if anybody has the over 18 version of Facebook on their phone, Facebook can do whatever. And so they shouldn't be liable because it's on Apple and Google to verify the age at the point of purchase or download, and it shouldn't be on them anyway. So that proposal has zero traction in Congress, as you might imagine. But it really is an open question as to what that would look like, because there is no privacy protecting, legitimate, accurate way to verify somebody's age. And so again, at EFF, we would argue that anonymous browsing, anonymous commenting, anonymous expression is protected by the First Amendment, and Congress can't pass a law to get rid of that. So there's that.
Yes. And wouldn't it be lovely if Congress respected our First Amendment rights all the time?
Well, we talk about this internally a lot, and the job of Congress is to legislate problems. It's the job of the courts to figure out what's constitutional or not. And that's a pretty important distinction and separation that you have to keep in mind when we're talking about this. Because again, the impetus here is that children are seeing bad things. And we frustrated parents who are overwhelmed are asking for Congress to do something. You have to do something about this problem, because as a parent, I don't know what to do. So Congress, this is a known problem. I need you to do something about it. And so this is the solution that Congress has come up with. We think it's the wrong one. We think it won't help. We think it'll hurt way more than it will help. And we think it's unconstitutional. But that's really where this is coming from, is the need to do something.
Yeah, absolutely. Melody, anything you want to add to that before I move to our next question?
That was pretty comprehensive. I don't know that I have a lot to add.
Yeah, and I would say that, I was reading an article recently, Europe has kind of been a little bit ahead of the US in terms of some of this legislation and passing various things. And one of the things I read about yesterday is a sex education website aimed at teenagers was banned in Germany. It was caught by the filter that they're using, that they've mandated for whatever reason to keep kids safe online. And so there's an example of something I could very easily see happening here in the US should any number of these laws pass, which is what we would like to avoid. So we're talking a little bit about the federal level, but we've kind of seen censorship in a lot of different places. So I would like to ask for each of you, where, like, which level of government or in which institutions are we seeing a lot of this show up? If one of our attendees today only has time to really pay attention to one place, where can they be the most effective? Where are these things happening? And I'm going to start with Jacqueline this time.
Well, so far, the vast majority of legislation undermining the freedom to learn has been at the state level. If a Republican wins the presidential election in 2024, so far it's been at the state level. And, like, I can name particular states where, Florida, Texas, where, some of the laws have been particularly egregious. But on our website, pen.org, there's actually a map that you can look at that will show you where the legislation has been passed or proposed across the United States. And it's all over the place, including in blue states. At least it's been proposed in blue state, in New York, for instance.
Yeah. Melody, are you seeing the same thing with sex work legislation?
Yeah, largely sex work legislation happens most of the time at the state or even municipal or county levels. Like in Maine, we're seeing the passage of what we call the Nordic model, though it's branded as partial decriminalization, which it is not that. But essentially, yeah, these statewide bills affecting, where people can be and what they can wear in public, and then that translating to like online spaces, right? Like what is acceptable to put forward as a public image. I see thematically as being one of the larger pieces of this is like who we are and who we express ourselves to be, whether that's sexually or intellectually or in terms of gender identity expression, is all being attacked. And it's largely because of fear. People don't understand what it means, or do understand what it means, or think they understand what it means and don't like it, right? Or that expression or that articulation of that expression is offensive, or whatever. And people, as you mentioned, Mandy, are really like asking and demanding really from Congress and from state legislatures that something be done. And we particularly are seeing a lot of legislation being made without sex workers at the table, right? Which is incredibly harmful to our communities and has ripple effects, right? So we, I think, really should emphasize, folks with lived experience being at the front and center of helping to create some of this legislation, because that's really the only way to get this kind of like nuanced approach to solving the issues. And so I think for 2024, I really encourage folks to, as Jacqueline said, don't take your state color for granted, right? Because the censorship thing happens across party lines, and Also question the headlines. There are headlines coming out about, porn harming children, about adult entertainment, and even like things like drag, right, being banned and talked about as obscene and things like that. And I really want to encourage folks to take a deeper dive into what that means and to introspect, where they feel that where they feel a tension or a fear or a knee-jerk reaction to these kind of big headlines, to really pause and introspect and think about the thing in context.
Yeah, good advice for every issue, I would say. And India, I know your focus is on the federal level. So my question is slightly different for you. And that is, are you seeing a lot of this legislation in one particular house, Senate versus House of Representatives? Are you seeing any particular players or senators who have really focused on this issue for maybe folks in those specific states to, give a call to their elected official?
Well, yes, but to answer the first question first, I did
Yeah.
want to say that EFF is a member-driven organization, and we have an Action Center page. It's act.eff.org, and you can sign up for action alerts. So when things like this come up at both the state and federal level, we'll sometimes send things out to our members or people who've signed up for our mailing list. And so we have a tool that makes it easy for people to send emails to their legislators that says this is bad and you should stop it. And that as a former congressional staffer, I cannot tell you how important that actually is. We as advocates can do a lot, but if we're not getting the support from the grassroots community and the elected officials are not hearing it from the grassroots community, the people that are in their community, it's really easy for them to ignore us because they're hearing from parents on the other side. So they need to hear from their constituents who think that this is wrong. That is actually really, it doesn't feel like a lot because it takes you 5 minutes and you can do it from home, but it actually makes a really huge difference. So check that out. Tell your neighbors, tell your friends. We also have a brand new youth membership level. It's called our Neon membership level, and it's for kids or people 18 years and older. And it's we will not verify your age. It is honor system only. You can just tell us that that's what you are and go from there. Anyway, so yes, there are some particular senators we've seen in the past legislation from Senator Blumenthal on this issue. He was one of the sponsors of FOSTA. And so he's also one of the lead sponsors on COSA, along with Marsha Blackburn from Tennessee. But we're also seeing some of this type of legislation from Senator Durbin in Illinois, who's also the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He has a bill called Stop CSAM that is a little bit different from COSA and some of those other things, but it would have the impact of undermining encryption protocols and some other things like that. So that's also something to keep an eye on. There's just a lot of different threats for this. In the House, things have been a little bit different this year just because of so many leadership changes in the House that we haven't seen this topic covered quite as much, though it's an election year, things that might change. And if the Senate actually puts any of these bills, there's 5 bills that I'm tracking on the Senate side, either related to encryption or censorship or something related to that category. There's about 5. And we have actions against all of them on our Action Center, act.eff.org. If those do make it to the Senate floor and get sent to the House, I don't know what will happen over there. So a lot of the original sponsors in the House of FOSTA are still there. So if you're interested in those folks, you can take a look at that. But the focus hasn't been as much in the House as in the Senate this year. So I don't know. I really don't know what's going to happen in Congress in the next couple of months. You may have heard there's a big funding deadline early March that we have to pass some funding bills to keep the government open, and that's going to take up some time. And then you may have also heard we have a pretty massive election coming up this year. So I don't entirely know what's going to get floor time, but this idea of like saving the children from the bad stuff is going to continue to be pretty central. So folks in Tennessee, folks in Connecticut, folks in Illinois, folks in Washington State. Senator Cantwell is the chair of the Commerce Committee, and even though she's not a lead sponsor on any of those bills, her committee has jurisdiction over a lot of them. So making sure that she knows that this is not something that her constituents want her to be focusing on would be really critically important.
Absolutely. Thank you for all of that. All right. So well said. Thank you for all of those resources. I am a subscriber to those EFF emails, by the way, and I do sign all of those actions. So I would definitely encourage folks to check that out. All right. So let's like dream a little bit here. We've talked about a lot of bad legislation we don't like. It's January. It's a new year. We're getting to the tail end of New Year's resolution season. The gyms are starting to empty out again as we move into February, right? But if you all could give our legislators a New Year's resolution in terms of what they could do to better protect free speech, free expression, sexual freedom, what might your resolution for them be? And I'm going to start with you, Melody.
Well, I'm always a big fan of an upstream solution, right? So I think if a legislator is concerned about sex trafficking, which we all are, right? We never want folks to be in a position where they're, forced or coerced into anything, let alone work, let alone sex work. But if people are actually concerned about exploitation, I think we need legislators to pass upstream solutions, right? Like age-appropriate, comprehensive sex education, right? We need anti-poverty bills, right? Things that uplift folks from poverty or allow for social mobility without the burden of going through systems as usual, right? Like going through education, master's degree, internships, all of those things. Like people need access to income without barriers and without strings attached, right? So housing first legislation, right? Housing that's accessible again and low barrier, right? We need people to understand and be able to fight for their own autonomy as well. And so I think taking away resources or banning books or banning expression on the internet is actually really counter to what it is we want to see in the world. And so I really, really urge legislators and people who work with legislators to, again, include folks with lived experience in the data collection process, into the testimony process, and really try to make decisions that aren't based on fears, right? And that are based in understanding and reason. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, Indy, I have a feeling about one thing that might be on your wish list that you mentioned a few times, but what would you say? What would you like our legislators to do this year?
Comprehensive, consumer-focused privacy education or privacy legislation. We actually have, we did a big white paper called Privacy First that, a lot of the things that we're also seeing, save the children from the bad things, but also tech companies are bad and we should punish them and hold them accountable for these bad things. And honestly, if you do comprehensive consumer-focused privacy legislation with no federal preemption so that states can do their own work, so with an individual private right of action, so we can have class action lawsuits against bad actors, that's actually going to go a long way to holding the platforms accountable for the choices that they make or the choices they choose not to make. And it will give a lot more power to the individual users to have the type of experience that they want to have online, including seniors, including military and veteran service personnel, including children, including young adults, including everybody. Like, we all deserve privacy, and not just the children may be the most sympathetic, but I actually, politically, I guess, but like, in reality, I don't think that's true. I think we all deserve privacy protections. And the fact that Congress is focusing on children is because they think it might be politically easier. But I would argue that it's just as hard to do good privacy legislation for children, and harder because of the age verification piece. So if you just do it for everyone, you can skip one of those hard steps and focus on the stuff that's actually hard, which is getting a really good bill and getting it through the gauntlet of all of the data brokers and the Fortune 5 companies that are going to oppose it because they want to be able to continue to do business as usual, even though that's not what users want. That's not what's best for users. And I think it's actually hurting people. So focus on doing the hard thing that will actually fix the problem, and not the thing that sounds good politically that won't fix the problem and will actually create new and worse problems.
Yeah. Yeah. In one of our COSA talks last year, I forget who I was talking to, but they were like, why can't the internet just be safe for everybody? And I was like, yeah, wow, what a novel idea. And, the other thing I would add is that, our right to privacy is a human right. It's outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it would be lovely to have that respected and protected legislatively. Okay, Jacqueline, what's on your wish list for our legislators this year?
So PEN America's wish list has 3 items. Number 1, stop enacting bad legislation. Number 2, repeal the bad legislation that's been enacted. And then number 3, just leave it alone. I mean, our position is basically that when it comes to higher education, the state shouldn't tell professors what they can and can't teach, because that violates academic freedom. And then when it comes to K through 12 teaching, obviously the standards of academic freedom don't apply in the same way. And teachers in a K through 12 school, K through 12 schools can't say whatever they want in the classroom, and there are standards that they need to meet. But the legislation we've seen it just presents a ridiculous attempt to stifle conversation about racism, about history, about sex, sexual diversity, about gender, about all of the things that are perfectly legitimate to talk about in a K through 12 classroom. So the long and short of it is, just stop enacting this terrible legislation. We don't have any legislation that we would particularly like to see enacted, because it's just unnecessary in the absence of this terrible, hopefully the absence of this terrible legislation that we've been seeing.
Yeah, it sounds so simple with the 3 of us here. I don't know why Congress isn't just calling us to deal with all of these issues, right? Just follow Woodhull, come to the Censorship Series. It's that simple. Okay. So I have one last question for all of you. Well, two questions actually. But what is your advice for folks who want to fight against these things? And we've heard some good resources in terms of like EFF has an action center and calling your congressperson. But if we're calling our Congress people or our representatives or our mayors, whoever at each level, what are we saying to them? Right? What do you all think is the most effective, or what's your advice for those folks who are wanting to engage and fight against these issues? And Jacqueline, I'll start with you.
Okay, I'm going to give a slightly longer answer to this question by just talking about what we might see in 2024, and then I will talk about what people can do about it. So, we think we're probably going to see the targeting of social emotional learning in K through 12 schools. And for those who don't know, social emotional learning is a pedagogical model that emphasizes students' like emotional well-being and emotional regulation. So we have seen some targeting of that. We're probably going to see more of it. We're going to see more targeting of LGBTQ identities in higher education. We're going to see an intensification of the attack on DEI and the attack on accreditation. This is really scary. So accreditation has long been a bulwark, a line of defense against educational censorship legislation. And we have started to see attempts to undermine the power of accreditors and the autonomy of accreditors, and we're probably going to see more of that. So that should be on the radar for everyone, in addition to increased attempts to shutter like entire programs and disciplines like sociology or gender studies. So what can people do about it? Well, get involved with what's going on locally. That's number one. So when it comes to book bans, as we were talking about before, a lot of this is happening on the hyper local level, like in particular school districts. Get involved in what's happening in your school district. Go to the board meetings. Be a voice when book ban when book bans are being when there's a threat that books are going to be banned, be a voice against that. Number two, speak out in defense of education. And this includes or encompasses the entire educational span, K through 12 and higher education. We know that over the past decade or so, Americans' views of higher education in particular have plummeted significantly. Obviously, higher education is beset with a lot of problems, which I won't go into, but I think it's important that people, champion education as a necessary kind of feature of our democracy. And a cornerstone of our democracy, actually. And so being a voice in defense of teachers and of educational institutions, whether it's with your friends and family or your neighbors or people in your community across the political aisle, speaking out against this legislation and in defense of our schools. And that includes, again, schools at all levels and our teachers. Those are the most important, I think, everyday actions people can take to fight censorship and champion the freedom to learn.
Absolutely. Indy, I'm going to go to you next, and then we'll end with you, Melody.
I mean, obviously, a great way is to become a member of EFF. We are a member-driven organization. We have about 35,000 dues-paying members, and we always need more. That's where our support and our funding comes from. But the other thing, as we mentioned before, is make sure that you are, as Jacqueline mentioned, make sure that you're paying attention. So just because you don't necessarily have children in school doesn't mean that these types of laws aren't going to impact what you get to see. Just because you don't have teenagers, just because you're not really interested in some of this content that's being discussed, that doesn't mean that you're not going to be impacted with that. That's one of the big things that we saw with people choosing to not get involved with FOSTA SESTA. It's like, well, I'm not a sex trafficker and I'm not dealing with sex traffickers, so this legislation isn't going to impact me. Sex traffickers are all bad people. I'm good people, so I don't have to worry. And that's quite simply not how this works. That's not how censorship works. There is no way for platforms to be able to get it right 100% of the time. So that means this legislation is going to impact all internet users, whether or not you're under 18. So being aware of that and the things that will impact you is really the critical step in communicating that with your legislators. And so then it makes, from my past experience, when you communicate with your legislators, you have to be really clear on what you mean. If you send an email or you make a phone call and say, hi, I'm against censorship, they don't know what to do with that necessarily. So you need to say, hello, my name is India McKinney. My address is blah, 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 blah. And I would like you to oppose COSA. I would like you to oppose the Stop CSAM Act. And I would like a response from the member. That changes how it is interpreted. You need to say your legitimate address so they know that you're a constituent. And you need to be specific about what you want them to do, not just what you think. I want you to oppose this legislation. I want you to support consumer privacy legislation. Like, it needs to be as specific as you can possibly make it. Bill numbers are really useful. Bill titles are really useful. So because there's a lot, each House district represents, I think it's up to like 700,000 people. And states are obviously quite a lot more than that. So if you live in one of the big states like California, there are millions of people that live in California. So making it easy for them to sort your communications into the piles, put it into the database. So when they're giving the reports to the elected officials, it's easy for your email, your phone call to get counted into, if you want to get into the database. By law, they're not allowed to sell or rent your information. You will get spammed by them.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's going to happen, but they're not allowed to share it with anybody else. So be aware of that. You can unsubscribe. That usually works pretty well. But use early and often. I mean, and it's, again, more useful for you to get your friends to do it. And so 20 different people send the exact same, super boring, not creative, no freedom of expression really necessary. I want you to oppose this. I want you to support this. You get 20 people to send the exact same letter. It's going to do a whole lot more than if you yourself send the same letter 20 times. You only get one vote in an election. Your letter only counts one time in the database. So get your friends, send the things, and then, we'll change hearts and minds, and maybe we can actually do some good.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are some really good tips. I think sometimes people get intimidated reaching out to their congressperson, but it really just needs to be very simple and, whatever.
You don't have to do it through EFF's Action Center. We try to make it easy, but all elected members now have a website, and on their website, they have a contact me form. You do not have to pick up the phone. You do not have to talk to a person. You can do it on your own schedule. You can do it on the weekends. Email works great. The critical plot points are that you say specifically what you want, who you are, what your actual address is, so they can verify where you live and that you're a constituent, and that you'd like a response. It doesn't have to be any more complicated than that.
Yep. And I found they will often send you a very long response. I get very long emails from Senator Chuck Schumer quite frequently. Okay, Melody, bring us home. What's your advice? What are your thoughts?
One of the easiest things that the average person can do to fight censorship is donate to Woodhull Freedom Foundation. They've really been pioneers in getting this information out there, in putting together this programming, which I think is really important. Give $5, give monthly, give one time, but this work is really critical to helping, again, push these issues upstream. So yes, call your legislators, and yes, use EFF Action Center, but also give to Woodhull and to local groups in your area, maybe that are also fighting this censorship ridiculousness. And at New Moon Network, we are also we have a repository that we built of resources for folks who are interested in advocacy around sexual health, sex work advocacy, sex worker rights, called Air Directory. And we'll have that as a resource as well for folks. But plug in where you can. We'll have opportunities to get involved and to be able to directly fight some of the censorship stuff.
Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better myself, honestly. And all of those links, all those things that all of you mentioned are going to be in that follow-up email. So folks, just check your inbox in about 24 hours and it'll be there. So thank you all so much. I feel like I learned a whole lot today. And I always leave these conversations feeling really, really inspired. So I appreciate all of your time. Appreciate you sharing your wisdom, not only with me, but everybody who tuned in today. And, here we go. Let's have a great 2024 free of censorship. That's my goal for the year. All right. Once again, thank you everybody for joining us today. I want to give a special thank you to Kaylee and Amanda, who are our fabulous ASL interpreters. Really appreciate you being here. Our panelists, I learned a lot, and I consider it a privilege to be able to learn from all these brilliant people every month. I will be here every month with a different topic. I'm in the midst of planning February right now, but it looks like we're going to be talking about the link between abortion access and censorship in a post-Roe United States. So that should be really interesting. Please check your inboxes and Woodhull social media for information about how to register for that. And I will also say, if there's a topic I have not covered that you would like to see us talk about, shoot me an email. I'm mandy@woodhullfoundation.org. I'd love to talk with you about what is interesting or support you if you are fighting censorship in your own community. And last but not least, if you're tuning in every month, if you're learning something, if you're getting inspired, please head on over to woodhullfoundation.org/donate, make a donation. These programs are always free. They always go on YouTube, and they always have ASL because we want them to reach the maximum amount of people and do the most good, but we can't do that without support. So if you're able, we'd really appreciate a donation from you today. So thanks again, everybody, for being here, and I'll see you next month.